Well, Professor Craig Evans, it's such an honor to have you here on the show. And can you maybe just to start us off, tell us a bit about yourself and your work?
Well, I did my PhD actually in biblical literature in general, but my dissertation was on Isaiah. That was, I won't tell you how many years ago that was, but I had the privilege of working under William Brownlee, who was at Qumran and in Israel when the scrolls first came to light, 1947, 1948. So that, of course, launched everybody's career. But I did my PhD back in the day with him and talked about the great Isaiah scroll. As it turned out, though, I was, for my academic career, I was hired at McMaster University in 1980 to take the courses that E.P. Sanders didn't have to teach because he had a grant that year. E.P. Sanders had become famous as the author of Paul and Palestinian Judaism. So what a way for my career to start, teach his courses, get to know him at McMaster University. And the result of that, not only did I shift into New Testament as a specialty instead of Isaiah and the Old Testament, but I began working in historical Jesus, Jesus's use of Isaiah, the Old Testament backdrop to Jesus and the Gospels. And that's been my career since. And so I have expertise in scrolls, studied with Jim Sanders, John Trevor, William Brownlee at Claremont back in the day. And I was in Canada for 35 years, mostly in British Columbia, Trinity Western University, where I founded the Dead Sea Scrolls Institute. Peter Flint, Marty Abegg, well-known scroll scholars. There
I'm
for
from
years.
Vancouver, actually. I
Yep,
uh,
there
I
you
grew
are.
up right down by Science World, so you were probably just right over there my whole childhood.
Well,
So yeah,
from the 80s on into the 90s, I was a frequent guest at Regent College.
yeah,
On,
that's where we both went. So
yep,
yeah,
on the campus of UBC and Vancouver School of Theology. I was often there, taught courses from time to time, got to know people like Gordon Fee, for example, and some of the other great faculty at Regent and at UBC. And so that was my career for a long time. Then I ended up in the East from sea to shining sea. I went from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and I was in Nova Scotia at Acadia University, where I taught at the Divinity College for 13 years. And then it's coming up on 10 years this December, moved to Houston, Texas, which is where I am now. And for 10 years was on the faculty of Houston Baptist University, now Houston Christian University. And I retired, but didn't retire for long. I actually have just been picked up. I'm starting again officially as of July 1st at the Bible Seminary, just up the street from where I live. And I'm excited about that. They've got great faculty. It's a small school, 230 students. But the provost is Scott Stripling, who's been in the news a lot lately. He's an archaeologist. He's the one who not only his team doing wet sifting at Mount Ebal found the lead tablet, which appears to be a curse tablet, which correlates with the end of Deuteronomy that says when you enter the promised land, folks, some of you are up on Mount Gerizim with the blessings and some of you are up on Mount Ebal with the curses back and forth. That's actually spelled out. I think it's Deuteronomy 27. So this not only correlates with that teaching that, in fact, the Israelites did that, but the date of the tablet, the Paleo Hebrew use, has strong indications that the early date for the Exodus and the conquest of the land is probably the correct date. So that's significant. Now, scholars are still mulling it over. And then Scott and his team, who, by the way, had a harrowing departure from Israel only days ago because of the current war. Anyway, they may have found one of the locations in Shiloh where the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle would have stood at one time back in the days of Samuel and even earlier. So he's involved in a lot of important stuff. So it's great to be there. And so my career continues. I'm finishing up the revision of the Mark Commentary and Word Biblical Commentary series, and I have a few other projects underway as well. So it's good to be with you, and I look forward to the things we're going to be talking about.
Awesome. I'm excited about it as well because I still remember my freshman year of college. The first book that I read, first nonfiction book that I read for fun was Fabricating Jesus.
Yeah, it's been
Someone,
almost 20 years. I know.
yeah, oh gosh, yeah. I mean, it's been about that long since I read it, and John, you're muted, by the way.
I still have Steph's copy. I stole his copy of Fabricating Jesus so I could read it, and a decade later, I still haven't given it back. It's a great book.
Well, I will say, and I don't just say this to flatter you, it was I never thought would be able to finish a 300-page book, but I think I did in 2 weeks, which for a freshman in college is definitely saying something. Very interesting book. And it was the first time I'd really even had heard about these ideas of Gnostic Gospels. I'd heard a little bit about Gnosticism and Gnostic Gospels. But for our audience, it might be a new concept. What are the Gnostic Gospels? And can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, it's a complicated topic, so I'll leave a few parts out, keep it simple. These are writings that began to appear in the second century, when at the earliest about 100 years after the death, resurrection of Jesus and the beginning of the church. So maybe as early as 130s, 140s, on into the end of the second century and beyond, on into the third century, the 200s. Irenaeus, the church father, writing his Against Heresies in 180 AD, he talks about several of them, including the Gospel of Judas, by the way, which not that long ago was discovered and published, about 20 years ago, was published by the National Geographic Society. That was a big hubbub. I was part of that too. The Gnostic Gospels, basically what they do, they emphasize the non-corporeal, the non-bodily aspect of Jesus. The Gnostic Gospels are not interested in Jesus as a Jew, not interested in the Jewish backdrop to Jesus's ministry, don't care at all about Israel, don't care about the Old Testament, the whole idea of traditional messianism, prophecies fulfilled, none of that matters. The Gnostic Gospels portray Jesus as this being from heaven who comes down as a revealer of gnosis, knowledge, that's where salvation is to be found, in knowledge, so you can escape this dirtball planet, earth, place of darkness, get up to the God of light above. So the Gnostics bought into a radical Neoplatonistic view that there's heaven above where the God of light is, there's this corrupt world below where a second inferior God is. Some humans have a divine spark in their heart. The bad God wants to keep us here because we're like the ever-ready batteries. We keep the world going. But Jesus comes down as the revealer. He explains this. Those of us who possess this spark, we go, oh, I see. So we then acquire the knowledge we need to escape, and get back up into God and the spirit world above that's full of light. So anyway, they wanted Jesus to be that. So Jesus becomes this Neoplatonic, radical, dualistic revealer of knowledge. And so some parts of Jesus's teaching that you have in the first century New Testament Gospels are picked up and expanded on in fantastic ways. We hear of 7 layers of heaven, for example, the 8th place, the Agdoad up above, all this kind of stuff. And the early Christian leaders recognized it for the, for the fiction and baloney that it is, and rejected it. But there were a lot of people attracted to it. It's mystical, it's esoteric, it's secret, it's special. Ordinary Christians are kind of dumb. They don't know this stuff. So this was the mix in the second century. Now, there were other gospels too. There were other gospels kicking around that they weren't Gnostic. They were apocryphal. They were false also. But the Gnostic ideas were not of any interest to them. They were esoteric. Here's new teaching, but not necessarily of a Gnostic nature.
What are some examples of these other gospels that were floating around but weren't necessarily Gnostic? Because I sometimes hear these all looped together.
Yeah, the Gospel of Thomas is one of them, and it's the most popular, and for good reason. It probably has the best material, and it isn't this holus bolus, Gnostic stuff. It's esoteric, and it advances late second century Syrian ideas of, legalism, anti-commercial, anti-physical world, anti-wealth, attitudes, even anti-marriage, anti-sex, a very ascetic lifestyle, which was popular in some circles in second century Syrian Christianity. And it was a popular book. It was many copies of it. It ended up translated, or originally was written in Greek, but it ended up translated into Coptic and circulating in Egypt. So we have 3 fragments of manuscripts in Greek from the 3rd century, a 4th century, late 4th century Coptic translation. Scholars were enamored with it, still are. Some try to argue that it's early, and we can talk about that if you wish, why I think that's problematic. And there's the gospel, supposedly the secret version or mystical version of Mark, found 2 quotations in a letter supposedly written by Clement of Alexandria. There's, of course, a lot of question about, is it really ancient? Is it a modern fake? We don't know. And fragments and quotations of other versions, the Jewish Gospels, supposedly from the 2nd century. So, maybe 30 or so Gospels, grand total, not 85 or whatever you read in Da Vinci Code. That book is terribly misinformed. But anytime you have a new fragment, a papyrus fragment, it could be this big, 3 lines of text. Scholars go crazy and they want to talk about it, and why not? New information could be valuable. Of course, sometimes it's an outright forgery, like the Gospel of Jesus' wife that embarrassed Harvard Divinity School. You all remember hearing about that a decade ago and 12 years ago, something like that. And it's a modern fake. We actually know who wrote it, a guy living in Florida. Very embarrassing. So you have to be careful. And I've actually been phoned up by media saying, hey, something new has been discovered. What do you think? How important it is? And my response is always, look, we don't know if it has any importance at all until it's been properly studied and tested. Is it even authentic? Is it ancient? And I warn others against, don't jump up and down and say, oh man, this is the greatest thing since the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can look pretty foolish when a week later it comes out that, somebody manufactured it last year, so you got to be cautious.
Well, with that question of caution and is it authentic, is it not authentic, could you maybe give us sort of your thoughts, your evaluation of how authentic are these Gnostic Gospels? Do they actually tell us anything about the historical Jesus? How authentic are they?
Well, okay, an authentic can apply to 2 or 3 things. Are they ancient? In that sense, are they authentic? The answer is yes. They weren't manufactured, with the exception, of the Gospel of Jesus' wife, which is in Coptic and part of that genre. That's a fake, modern fake. It's no more than 20 years old. But these other Gnostic Gospels, for example, Coptic translations of which were found in the Nag Hammadi codices, yeah, they're genuine in the sense that they're Coptic. They go back to the 4th and 5th centuries AD as translations. Most of them are Coptic translations of earlier Greek writings that could reach back as early as the middle of the 2nd century, 140, 150, 160, something like that. So they're authentic in the sense they are ancient documents, and therefore they are worthy of study. And so I don't fault anybody who spends a lot of time mastering Coptic. And Stephen Emmel, who is an American, but he's in Germany, excellent scholar and a very fair-minded. Anything by Stephen Emmel is gold. But then you have others who, I won't mention any names, they don't know Coptic as well, and they run wild with it and try to say, oh, this gives us new insight about Jesus's marital life or something. And no, they don't. And by the way, responsible Coptic scholars know that perfectly well. It doesn't matter what Gospel of Mary says or Gospel of Philip says about some potential romantic relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. That isn't really what the texts say, for one thing. And of course, even if they did say that, nobody would think for a moment that it's historically true, which, John, that leads to your next point. Are they authentic in the sense that they give us authentic, genuine information about the Jesus of history, Jesus of the 20s and 30s AD? No, they don't. And so where they go beyond what the 1st century New Testament Gospels tell us, where they elaborate, go beyond, have Jesus providing secret revelations and that kind of thing, Nobody thinks the historical Jesus talked about 7 layers of heaven or all this Gnostic stuff. That's the stuff of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. That's of interest to later people who aren't really in the church, but they are trying to influence some Christians anyway. And that's why it was controversial. So, but in the popular media, who knows? They're going to talk about, hey, this new gospel came out. Now we know how many children Jesus had, and this kind of nonsense, but real scholars don't fool around with that.
The one I think that I hear the most about is the Gospel of Thomas. And sometimes you'll even hear like, oh, it was like excluded from the canon.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about like what some scholars are trying to do with the Gospel of Thomas? And what are your personal feelings about its date, how reliable it is, etc.?
Yeah, that's interesting. Somebody's going to have to write a new book about Thomas because I think everything's changed. My sense is that Thomas has been dethroned. Thomas was a big deal since the Coptic version came to light. It was published, I think, for the first time in 1948, the Coptic version with English translation. And man, it just took off running wild in the 60s and 70s. And then theories began to circulate. The late Helmut Kester at Harvard, some of his students, one of my professors at Claremont, the late James Robinson, the Thomas, no, it's not Q, but it's a Q-like document, a collection of sayings. It could be very early. Some of Robinson's pupils, some of Kester's pupils have argued that Thomas could date back to the 70s AD. April DeConnick actually has argued that it says, it was written in 3 or 4 stages. The earliest stage could be the 30s. I mean, that's pretty early. So somebody's writing the first draft of Thomas, 5 years after the resurrection. I mean, that's really early. By the way, that's a small minority view. But the reason I think Thomas has lost out, there have been ongoing studies, Simon Gathercole, Mark Goodacre, myself, others, who are pushing back and saying there's just too much 2nd century material in Thomas. You got parallels with forms of the Jesus tradition found in Tatian's Diatessaron, for example. That was written in the late 160s, early 170s AD, and he's blending gospel material together. It's a harmony. And when you blend parallel sayings together, you create a new saying, a new form. Well, some of these new forms are showing up in Thomas. Well, how's that possible? These forms didn't exist until the 160s, 170s. And then you get some distinctive Syrian ideas, contrary to food, contrary to marriage, ideas like esoteric ideas. And then we hear them echoed in Thomas. And these ideas didn't come into expression until the second half of the 2nd century. And there are other factors too, linguistic kinds of arguments as well. And so scholars are saying, I don't think Thomas should be dated any earlier than the end of the 2nd century. And Gathercole and Goodacre in their works that came out in 2012, I think the very same year, they concluded that the author of Thomas is familiar with every aspect of the Synoptic Gospels. In other words, not just Mark, if most people are Mark and Prioritas, and Q, and most people still hold on to Q, but material distinctive to Matthew, distinctive to Luke, the editing of Matthew and Luke as they edit their Mark and Q sources, all of that, John, the Gospel of John, all of that is showing up in Thomas. The work I've done with scholars 30 years ago, we think 14 or 15 of the New Testament books are echoed or quoted in Thomas. Now, how in the world would anybody, if Thomas dates to the 60s, 70s, 80s of the 1st century, how would they be familiar at that time with half of the New Testament? So when you add up all of these factors, it argues strongly, I think, that Thomas can't be written, the Thomas that we have can't be written earlier than 180. Now, one of the tactics, John Dominic Crossan, for example, Stephen Patterson, for example, and April DeConnick, for example, in her own way, what they'll say is, oh, no, we're not talking about what we actually have. the Coptic text, which you can retrovert into Greek, or the Greek fragments that we have, we imagine early versions. Well, you can't take what you have, mutilate it, take out all the evidence of late stuff, and I say, wow, look, can you imagine, what skeptical scholars in Pauline studies who say Paul didn't write the three pastorals, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And they make their argument that there's stuff in these letters that, in their opinion, is maybe alluding to Gnosticism, fables, myths that some people pursue, perhaps alluding to church structures that reflect the second century instead of the first. Well, what if somebody like me came along and said, well, let me see these letters. And I took my red pencil and I circled every single phrase, every single verse, 3 or 4 in each letter, that they point to as evidence that they're second century. And I said, well, yeah, you're looking at the way they are now. I'm interested in the way they were originally. And so I then delete all the supposed second century evidence and say, see, these are first century letters. Now we can date them to the 60s when Paul is still alive. And so the arguments against Pauline authorship, authenticity, so on, those arguments are now refuted. Well, who would accept that? On the left or the right? Who would say, oh gosh, I hadn't thought of that. You're right. I guess they are authentic in their early form. Not in the later form where they've been embellished a bit and updated. Well, nobody would accept that. They'd say you have to stick with the evidence that you have. And I would say the same thing applies to Thomas. We've got 3 distinct manuscripts in Greek. They're small chunks. Put together, they add up to 22% of the whole. And then, of course, we have the Coptic translation of the whole, and that's at Nagamani. And so there's no evidence that they've been massively changed. The Greek agrees with, with a few minor exceptions, the Greek agrees with what's in the Coptic translation. So on what basis then do you tamper with the evidence, remove lots of stuff from all over the place so you can shrink it down into something that might fit the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, somewhere in the middle of the first century? Well, that's not a legitimate form of historical research. Historians do not do that with documents. They don't. No, that won't work. So I'm sorry, Thomas reflects late second century Syrian ideas in lots of places. Thomas knows of half of the New Testament. And nobody knows that much of the New Testament until you get into the second half of the second century. So I think, guys, that's becoming known. I'm not going to name any names, but I do know some of these Thomas experts, and I sense discouragement and giving up on the idea that the argument for Thomas being early and therefore great insight into who Jesus really was, my sense is that's waning. Anyway, I suspect there'll be an interesting book that shows up in the future that says that. My own, if you want to know what I think, Jesus in the Manuscripts came out in 2020. I have 2 chapters. I think they're chapters 4 and 5 or 3 and 4, whatever. Two big chapters on Thomas. I lay this all out. And to me, it's, and by the way, Thomas has great value. That's another point I want to make. There's a little bit of imperialism going on here, or bias or something. There's a hidden assumption that is Thomas doesn't have any value unless we can date it to the first century. Thomas, just should be ignored. If it doesn't really tell us about the historical Jesus, forget about it. Well, now, wait a minute. Thomas is an important document that tells us about distinctive ideas floating around in second century Syrian Christianity. Isn't that worth knowing? Specialists in second and third century Syrian Christianity think it's important. And so the Thomasine literature, it isn't just the Gospel of Thomas, it's the Acts of Thomas, Thomas the athlete. I mean, there's a variety of stuff. The idea that Thomas is Jesus' twin brother, this is of great fascination for church historians. So we need to watch out on that. There's something, I think, narrow-minded and wrong-headed about, this has no value unless we can do something with it that it really doesn't want to do. Jewish scholars tell Christian scholars that all the time. Why do you go to the Talmud? Only because it might tell you something about the historical Jesus. Doesn't the Talmudic literature have value in its own right? And I agree with that. Interpret the literature for what it is. If it happens to shed light on a first century figure or event or something, well, that's fine. But don't you're ransacking it. You're looting the text. You're smash and grab. I want this and I want that. The rest of it, I'll ignore it. And then you don't understand it very well. And you end up saying naive things about the text, or you distort it. So I think that's part of the bigger picture. I think scholars are getting that message. And so Thomas, in my sense, is receding to the background. And people are going, yeah, well, that's interesting. Let's move on. That's kind of my sense.
That's interesting. And I'm curious then, if not the Gospel of Thomas, are there any of these other Gospels that you think could, even in theory, be dated early to around the time of the four canonical Gospels?
No, not really. That doesn't mean they don't potentially have a saying or form of saying or a contextual point that could shed light on the first century. Thomas might, in a few places, have a particular form of saying that could reach back to an earlier form. Some of the interesting quotations, we don't have the Jewish Gospels extant as manuscripts. We only have quotations. So we have 3 or 4 church fathers that will say, well, the Gospel of the Nazarenes, the Gospel of the Ebionites, the Gospel of the Hebrews. But we have to be cautious there because what they quote is always what is something that is different. And so 90% of the text might be identical or almost identical to Matthew. But what the church fathers quote are just those few sayings that are different. And so we have to be cautious there. But it's always possible in some papyrus fragment, some quotation from a church father or whatever the source is. It could be. I mean, scholars should always be open-minded to the possibility that a given saying, even if it's found in a much later text, could reflect authentic first century tradition. But the assumption that the whole document does, or we can whittle it down to a certain portion of it and then run it back into the first century, they do that with the Edgerton papyrus, which I think combines synoptic and Johannine tradition. It's a harmony probably, or maybe a homily. Thomas, secret mark, even if we assume secret mark is ancient, which I find very doubtful. And the Fayum fragment, and a few of these others, you have to play games with them in order to make a case that they actually reflect something the historical Jesus would have said or would have done. And so I think critical scholarship needs to get a little more critical again and get back down to earth. And I think that is happening.
Could you tell us a bit more about the secret Gospel of Mark and why you don't think it's authentic, both in the sense that it doesn't tell us about the historical Jesus and also in the sense that you're not sure it's ancient?
John insisted that we talk about that one.
Yeah, I'm glad to. In fact, let me, for the first time, publicly air on your podcast a theory that I don't think has been voiced. It's not in print. I've been thinking about it on again, off again for 20 years. But the two views are basically this: that Morton Smith is telling the truth. He found it in 1958, written in the back of a book, 2.5 pages of 18th century Greek, he estimates, a monastic hand that reflects the way monks wrote in Mount Athos, Western Greece. And yet, curiously, this volume is found at Marsaba, which is halfway between Jerusalem in the west and the Dead Sea to the east. I've been to Marsaba. I've given lectures right at Marsaba before talking about this text. And so here's this old book by Isaac Voss. It's a critical edition. The book is written in Latin, but it's a critical edition of the letters of Ignatius. And then in the blank end papers in the back, here's this handwritten thing from a later time. So Smith hypothesized that there was a fire, manuscripts were damaged, and a damaged manuscript that's lost the back part of it is written out. It's a letter, supposedly, of the church father Clement of Alexandria to an otherwise unknown fellow named Theodore, answering his question about, is there really a mystical mark, mystikos gospel? And Clement is saying, yes, there is. I know it. I've read it. I've seen it. And here are a couple of passages in it. And the offensive one is the one where the young man is nude. The only thing on his naked body, and it really emphasized that he's not wearing any clothes. He's wrapped with a sheet, comes to Jesus at night, and Jesus teaches him the secrets of the kingdom of God and actually quotes Mark 4:11. And so Smith, who was gay, speculates that this is some kind of a homosexual union between, Jesus and his disciple. And of course, he suggests that because of the way Clement in his letter reacts. There are blasphemous people who say awful, wicked, horrible things. So there is an innuendo that's clearly homoerotic. It's in the letter. There's no doubt about it. There are people who deny that, but I think that's naive. It clearly is there. And that's why, Clement is reacting. So there are people who accept his story and therefore accept, basically two views. Clement doesn't know what he's talking about. It's an apocryphal text at best, or it's late. Or, as Scott Brown has argued in his dissertation, and has fiercely defended ever since 1999 when his dissertation came out, he has argued that the letter not only is authentic, but Clement does know what he's talking about. There actually is a longer version of Mark. It goes back to the 1st century. And at the Mark that we have in our New Testament today is a shorter version where these texts have been removed. And so longer Mark is the authentic Mark, goes back to the 1st century. And of course, Morton Smith would love that, because, so you mean Jesus in the nude really did instruct, just young male disciples. Smith died in 1991, by the way, and so Scott Brown did know him, and Scott Brown is writing years and years later at University of Toronto. Anyway, the other view is the whole thing is a fake, that Morton Smith either composed it or someone else composed it. And of course, Smith very angrily threatened to sue people who had put that kind of statement in print. And so there's this long history. It has been debated and debated and debated and debated. Stephen Carlson came out with a book in 2005, same year, coincidentally, that Scott Brown's edited dissertation came out in print. Stephen Carlson, who now is in Australia, professor of New Testament, he has argued it most certainly is a fake. He's had handwriting people examine it. He himself, an attorney and a copyright specialist, has knowledge of handwriting analysis. And he shows Morton Smith as the author. He actually bought this book with blank end papers, and he wrote the 2.5 pages of Greek, studied the handwriting, how to imitate it. And I got to admit, the evidence there is suggestive. I don't know how well you know Greek, but you got the letter theta. Most of us write what looks like an O, and then we separate stroke as horizontal. Smith had a way of doing it with one stroke. He did that with the T, the tau. Instead of doing that and then that, as we usually do, he did this. He did the same thing with the L, the lambda, instead of two strokes, as most people do. And occasionally in the handwriting of this 2.5-page Greek text, this letter that quotes supposedly the long version of Mark, you get that written the same way. You actually get letters occasionally written that way. And so Carlson argued this is where he slips up. And he's trying to imitate a certain hand, does so very well most of the time, but occasionally slips up with these 3 letters. Okay. I'm no handwriting expert, so I just go with what they say. The late Herschel Shanks, founder of Biblical Archaeology Review, editor of it, he hired 2 Greek-speaking handwriting experts, and they disagreed. One of them said, yeah, Smith wrote it, and the other one, a younger, less experienced woman, said, no, I don't think he could. So there you are. The handwriting experts disagree. I'm no handwriting expert. I don't know. So did Smith fake it? Maybe, maybe not. I really don't know. But I'll tell you, there's some strongly suggestive stuff that something funny's going on. And here's why, and this is why I don't follow it. There are 3 publications by Smith prior to 1958 when he supposedly founded at Marsala. And in these 3 publications, he articulates very weird ideas that are in secret Mark. before he found it. And one of them was the quotation of Mark 4:11 about the mysteries of the kingdom are for you. And Smith provocatively suggests in his English version of his Hebrew university dissertation, he provocatively suggests that the secrets of the kingdom of God have to do with prohibited sexual activities. What the heck? Nobody ever thought that. The secrets of the kingdom are secret rites that involve prohibited sexual activity. Look in the history of the interpretation of that verse. No one has ever suggested that. Smith does, and Shazam, a few years later, finds a text where that is suggested. Whoa! That guy, he should buy lottery tickets. Now, there are two other things that one other one I'll mention, and that is he also suggests that in the original longer version of Mark, there was Johannine-like stuff, like the resurrection of the dead Lazarus, John 11. Well, Shazam! That's in secret Mark. This passage, the young man who comes to Jesus nude, is Lazarus who was raised from the dead. Well, boy, can you believe that from a scholarly point of view, speculating like that? And then finding a text that supports it a few years later? Oh my goodness. Now, guys, this is for you, brand new, your podcast, first to hear it. It's possible that Smith did not compose this text, that he did find it, not at Marsaba in 1958, but in a used bookshop in Jerusalem in 1940, or New York in 38, 39. Smith, you'll recall, was trapped in Israel for 4 years because of World War II. He's there, the war starts, it's too dangerous to come home through the Mediterranean, so he stays in Israel and he improves his knowledge of Hebrew, which really served him well. He got to know Gershom Scholem, the great Jewish scholar of mysticism and Gnosticism and so on. And I suspect that he already had the text, was struggling to read it. He borrowed books on monastic handwriting from Mount Athos, not because he wanted to imitate the text, but because he wanted to decipher the text. And I've tried to decipher monastic Greek. It is difficult. And so it's possible he is studying the text in the early 40s, marooned there, getting interested in an esoteric Jesus. He is gay. He is interested in magic. And it all comes together. What if Jesus was a magician, or there's a text talking about him as a magician, who happens also to be gay? And so for Smith, it's, do I run with this thing? It's the darndest text. I can hardly read it. I can hardly understand it. Written in the back of this book. Small, cramped writing style. And he's not sure what to do, but by the time we get to 1958, of course, the war is over. He's back in the United States. He has a teaching job. He's angry at Brown, which he felt religious men wouldn't hire him because he was too liberal. So he's angry at a conservative, straight Christianity. And he's going to get him. He's decided by 1958, you know what? I think this text is worth studying. He's transcribed it. He's photographed it. So he goes to Marsaba in 58 and he finds it and leaves it there, as he should. Otherwise, he's stealing it. He comes home, and in 1960 in New York, he announces the discovery that he made just 2 years ago. The problem is he's been talking about it by this point for over 10 years. That's what gives him away, unless you want to believe in extraordinary coincidences. Now, this is a new theory. Am I right? I don't know, maybe. This way, you don't have to argue that Smith wrote it out himself. You don't have to argue that he's guilty of some outrageous fabrication. The only thing he's guilty of, he hasn't told the truth about when and where he found the book. That's all. And it was only after he was convinced that scholars like Henry Chadwick, and some other great Harvard divines, they didn't point it out that it's obviously a hoax, obviously a fake. Morton, did you write this? Once he's convinced that nobody thinks it's obvious fake, people are suspicious, he then devotes the next 13 years and publishes it in 1973 in popular form and a 450-page technical form by Harvard University Press. And even he isn't sure if it's genuine, because in his 1970, 8 or 9, Jesus the Magician, he never appeals to the text to support his hypothesis that Jesus was a magician and perhaps gay. He doesn't even appeal to this text. Scholarly vanity would say, of course he would appeal to it. My gosh, he found the text that gives him evidence. But he doesn't. And I would argue it isn't because he knows it's fake. He wrote it himself. No. He just himself is never quite convinced that it's a credible text. So in the end, he doesn't rely on it in making his case. There you are, guys. You're the first to air this. You're going to get some interesting feedback.
I look forward to that.
You saw it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you for that very thoughtful, and I mean that was fascinating. How's the field gonna react to these types of things? I mean, this is obviously very controversial because it's not just biblical scholarship; it's contemporary sexuality debates and all of that stuff. I mean, what is the field around this book, and how have you been received in that, and how do you even think the comments you just made are going to be seen? Does it get lumped into there's the homophobic scholars and the not, or you know what I mean? Sorry, go ahead.
It's going to be mixed. There'll be people like Scott Brown who will probably say, well, I'm glad Professor Evans has recognized that it's not likely that Smith is the forger. He would take that as a win. But Scott is still invested in the idea that it's an ancient text, not just ancient, it's the original form of Mark. So it's very important text critical witness, at least in two different places in Mark chapter 10 and somewhere else. And so he will continue to argue for his theory, assuming he's still in scholarship. I'm not sure. He unfortunately never found a teaching position, so I don't know if he's still active. Tony Burke, who hosted the conference on forgeries at York University in Toronto in 2011. I was there, and my longtime good friend Marvin Meyer was there. Unfortunately, he died a year later, and he was always a supporter of the authenticity of Secret Mark. So we were very divided. Peter Jeffrey was there, Bruce Chilton was there, Stephen Carlson via Zoom. He was in Australia. And so it was a very divided group. And then this book came out a couple years later, published. It's on my shelf right over there. And they're arguing that it's authentic. And I thought my reply is, well, this book is on forgeries. And we have chapters on Secret Mark. Isn't that curious? So how convinced are you as editors of this volume that, I mean, if this is a conference on forgeries in antiquity, and here we are talking about Secret Mark, I think it is a forgery. The only real question is who's the forger? And a forger could be somebody from the 19th century, and Morton Smith finds the book, 30, 40 years later, and then is curious about it. And I think to the end of his life, wasn't really sure. The only thing he ever vehemently pushed back against was accusations that he was the forger. That would make him angry. And if he wasn't the forger, I can see why he was angry. But he never went out on a limb arguing that it was authentic. And to me, that's the smoking gun. His own book on the subject, Jesus as a magician and possibly gay, and he makes no use of secret mark. In fact, the late Robert Hamerton Kelly, in his review of Mark the Magician, criticizes Mark the Magician for, what a crazy theory resting on something so uncertain and dubious as secret mark. And Smith fired back and said, the allegation that I made use of secret mark for my theory is absolutely false. That is really interesting. So Smith clearly, knowingly, deliberately made no use of secret mark in building his thesis that Jesus was a gay magician. And I think that's very telling. And so that tells me that Smith, he didn't really know, is secret mark authentic or not? And so what Scott Brown says is, okay, Smith didn't understand it correctly. And so Scott wants to understand it better and is that way able to go back and argue that it's early and authentic. Now, Peter Jeffrey comes back and says the only way you can do that is to destroy the text. And that's similar to my argument about the Gospel of Thomas. The only way you can make secret mark first century or second century is to strip away all the lateness of it. And so you misinterpret it. You have to destroy the real meaning of the text. You have to destroy the text to save it for your use. That's similar to the argument I was making about Thomas. The only way you can make Thomas early is to mutilate it, to destroy the text. So my sense is, in fact, where we ended, Bruce Chilton made this argument, I made this argument in our closing remarks at this conference, is, folks, my recommendation is don't make use of this text for talking about the historic, authentic Clement of Alexandria, because in this letter he actually argues that you take an oath and lie. Well, the church father Clement of Alexandria, that flies in the face of everything he teaches. Take an oath and lie? Jesus says, don't take oaths and let your yes be yes. And here's a church father who knows the Dominical tradition inside and out, and he says, take an oath and lie? And say, oh, no, it doesn't exist, when in fact we all know it does. And the other thing is, this text, are you really going to deal with Mark and textual criticism on the basis of such a dubious text? And thirdly, are you really going to talk about the historical Jesus, perhaps as gay and as a magician, on the basis of this text? So our conclusion was, leave it alone. You don't need to accuse Morton Smith of anything. Just leave it alone. It's recommended, if you're going to be a scholar and critical, don't do anything with it. That's where it's been left. And my sense is, in scholarship in the 14 years since then, that's where we are. There's a couple of people out there. One of them is in Norway who keeps beating the drum. Marx, Smith didn't lie. It's genuine, blah, blah, blah. But mainstream scholarship is saying, forget it. If you're going to talk about Mark and the historical Jesus or the real church father, Clement of Alexandria, don't bother with this text.
I got to follow up on that. There just seems to be in scholarship a real strong desire to have other versions of Christianity in the first century, that the Orthodox, this idea of there's one Orthodox church and these weird deviations, that's sort of an antiquated idea. There were many different Christianities floating around fighting for dominance. And I see these texts, like, you have to get them into the first century to sort of create these competing branches with no one claiming the being right. What do you make of that claim?
Oh, it's very much a modern issue. It's modern psychology, modern sociology. You're exactly right. We don't want to marginalize anybody. That's a big word. We don't want to be guilty of imperialism. We don't want to be guilty of anachronism. The winners write the history. And so Orthodox Christianity, everybody didn't agree with us. They become heretics. They become marginalized. They're liars. You can't take them truthfully. So the problem is that archaeology, manuscript studies, and so on keep knocking holes in these new theories. And, so they'll come up with this historical Jesus who's this or that or never did this. And then somebody unearths something and golly goes, oh, yeah. And so there's some truth. I mean, yes, you do have to be careful. Winners do write the history, and people do have a tendency to be biased. So let's not be naive and close our eyes to that. But at the same time, let's not rush to the other side and embrace every newfangled theory that somebody proposes. And that's part of the psychology. Scholarship is always looking for something new. When you write a doctoral dissertation, they don't say, why don't you rehash all the old stuff and put it in your own words? No. Turn new ground. Dig up stuff. Learn something new. Well, there's so many unpublished texts, box loads of archaeological artifacts not yet published. It isn't hard to do, but you got to do some work. And just a rehash of what everybody's talking about. No. Get into the text, dig deep, learn some stuff, shed some light on something that's important. So I think some of it's laziness. No, I don't want to learn to read a bunch of text. No, I don't want to do that. I have my imagination, and I'm going to cook up something new. I'm going to climb up into the ivory tower no, I don't want my feet on the ground, nothing real here, and dream up a theory. And there is a bias in some circles toward whatever new theory there is. I mean, I was in the green room in 2006, April. We're getting ready to go on television, go in the media, and talk about the Gospel of Judas, the Chaco's Codex. What a moment. In the green room, eating pastries with Marvin Meyer. God rest his soul. And he was so excited. This is the Gospel of Judas. He looks at me and goes, Craig, I got an idea. Oh, yeah, help me here with this. What if Judas never existed? My wife is standing there. She looks at me, just, what am I hearing? And I looked at Marvin. He goes, Craig, what do you think of that? We could write a book and say there was never any Judas. It's this anti-Semitic creation of the early church. And I'm about ready to pop a carrot into my mouth, And I said, Marvin, that's not true. What are you talking about? And he looked hurt. Well, it'd make a great book. Marvin, that's not what we do. I mean, we can't reduce our scholarship to a circus with some barker like P.T. Barnum promoting it. We don't have any credibility. We do things like that. Now, he's an enthusiastic guy. I want to say I love Marvin. I miss him dearly. And he would have woke up the next morning sober and he'd have said, you know what, I agree, that isn't such a good idea. But that's where scholarship sometimes goes. I got to have something new, something outlandish. I can name other names. We got to come up with some brand new idea that just, I'm on TV, I'm getting interviewed, the media, they all want to know my thought. We got to stay sober, we got to keep our feet on the ground, and we got to be informed by the actual evidence and treat the real evidence with respect. That's what we got to do.
And speaking of evidence, can you tell us a little bit about, we've talked about a lot about like why these Gnostic and other Gospels aren't very reliable. Is there good evidence for thinking that the four Gospels in the canon are?
Well, hey, listen, I'm fair. I'm even-handed. If we're going to look at the 2nd century, 3rd century writings, Gospels, gospel-like writings, and, look at them hard and ask tough questions and test them, we need to do the same thing. Just because you're a 1st century gospel doesn't mean you get a pass. Just because there's a tradition linking you to Matthew or linking you to Mark or Peter or somebody doesn't mean you get a pass. And so you got to look at them hard. Well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts are 5 documents that have been looked at hard more than any other document in history. There's been real hard-nosed, oftentimes very skeptical, sometimes I would say unfairly so, scholarship looking at those 5 writings in the New Testament. So why do we then accept them? It's because they keep getting it right. Now, is that just my opinion? No. Go to Israel, talk to the archaeologists who are digging here and there and so on. Any archaeologist in Israel interested in the first century, interested in from, say, the year 1 to the year 70, interested in that period of time, they all take the gospel seriously. They have skin in the game like nobody else. I talked about, some scholar going up into the ivory tower where he can dream up a theory. That's not what archaeologists do. They go just the opposite. They go down into the ground and dig. And they ask 50 volunteers, 100 volunteers to pay $3,000, $4,000 each to fly to Israel, stay 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and be part of their volunteer diggers. Well, do you think the archaeologist wants to dig in the wrong place? He has no idea. Well, let's just dig here. No, they read the sources, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and Josephus, so those are the big 6, to know where to dig and how to understand what they find when they dig it up. They all do that. Jews, Christians, believers, non-believers, conservative, liberal, they all do that. Do you realize, guys, to move 50 tons or 100 tons of earth and rubble in one dig season is the norm? That's a heck of a lot of stuff. With trowels, 1 inch at a time, with buckets of debris, buckets of fine lifted up, backbreaking work, hours a day, 5 days a week, at least 2 weeks for volunteers. Some will do the whole 4-week session. That's a lot of skin in the game. Hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in it. Hundreds and hundreds of hours of sweat doing the work. And you've dug in a stupid place because the gospel of Peter, because of secret. Don't be stupid. There isn't an archaeologist in the land who says, I use Thomas. I wouldn't think to dig somewhere without secret Mark. No, it's always Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Book of Acts, and Josephus. And what do they find? They get it right. And so what they find, and this is called verisimilitude, ask any historian that knows what he's talking about, classical historian, ancient Near Eastern historian, whatever, verisimilitude. Does the writing in question, whether it's sacred or not, in a canon of scripture or not, does the writing in question reflect reality? That's verisimilitude. Does it speak of real people, places, and real events? Does it enjoy the support of archaeology? Does it enjoy the support of other credible historical sources? The 4 Gospels, the Book of Acts, and Josephus consistently do. And that's why they're always consulted. Not because of any canonical commitment. You might have a Jewish agnostic archaeologist, and you listen to him talk and you think he's a Baptist. No, he's not. He's a Jewish agnostic. He said, well, Matthew says this and that, and we dig. And John's gospel says this and that, and we dig. And yeah, that's right. And John's gospel helps us understand what we dug up. What we dug up helps us understand better John. You get this synergy between text and archaeology and other sources. And so when I say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are reliable, that's why I say it. Not because they happen to be in the New Testament. Not because a medieval church father said, they're inspired. I say that because they're confirmed again and again and again and again. They correlate with the reality as we dig it up and understand it better. And that's what makes Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Book of Acts, highly regarded by historians. There's a Gospel of Barnabas out there. It's 14th century. Muslims say, it's the real gospel. It correlates in a few places with Islamic teaching. Well, should we use it? I don't know any archaeologist that uses the Gospel of Barnabas. You know why? Why? Because Muslims like it? No, that's not why they ignore it. Because it's not in the New Testament? No, that's not why they ignore it. It's because whoever wrote it, wherever he departs from the New Testament Gospels and adds something new, doesn't know what the heck he's talking about. Let me give you a couple examples. In the Gospel of Barnabas, the disciples are in a boat and they row across the Sea of Galilee. Okay, fine. And they keep rowing their boat all the way to Nazareth. What? That's over 20 miles overland, up and down hills in a rowboat.
They have
Hey,
strong
folks,
arms.
hey, that's got to be a new Olympic event, overland rowing. Then they get out of the boat and they go inland, the Gospel of Barnabas says, to Capernaum. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He has this gospel has Roman soldiers with barrels of wine taking the barrels into the temple. Huh? Roman soldiers never went in the temple. And by the way, barrels of wine, oak barrels, that wasn't done till years and years and years later in Europe. That's not how wine was made in first century Israel. Other mistakes. Jesus is born during the administration of Pontius Pilate. What? Jesus started his ministry when he was 7? Was he crucified when he's 10? The opening line declares that this is the true gospel story written by the apostle Barnabas about Jesus the Christ. And then in it, Jesus says, I'm not the Messiah. Apparently, they don't know the Hebrew word Messiah and the Greek word Christ mean the same thing. Now, I could go on and on and on. So guess what? Gospel of Barnabas exhibits no verisimilitude wherever it goes off on its own and isn't following Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And so archaeologists and historians don't use it. And that's why. So it has nothing to do, is it in the canon or not? No, that's not it. It's the value of the document itself assessed against archaeology, other historical sources. The question is always, does it exhibit verisimilitude? If it does, we'll use it. If it doesn't, we won't.
Okay, so as soon as we cut the recording, Dr. Evans launched into a beautiful discussion about how much he loves gift baskets and how if we wanted to have him back on the show, gift baskets are the way. And then I told him that you, our audience members, should send him gift baskets. I know this is like a weird segue, but he lit up. He was so talking about a gift basket he'd received once from one of these shows. He just looked so childlike and full of joy. And it just made me want to get the man a gift basket. It was so please, if you're listening to this,
To the Bible Seminary, send it to the
send
Bible Seminary
Dr.
in Houston.
Evans. Yeah, please send him at his university gift baskets because it delights the man. You thought he was passionate talking about the Gospels. The room lit up when he was talking about how much he loves gift baskets. So,
Let me say it like this. Great is your reward in heaven.
yes.
Yes. I mean, he's one of the greatest, New Testament scholars defending Orthodox Christianity, and he do this for one of God's great saints on earth. Do it.
It feels like we're pitching. I know this is stupid, and if you weren't there, you might not understand why we're doing this like weird conversational thing, but he's such a brilliant man who's so accomplished. And then it transitioned to something so silly and playful and like gift basket, with the chocolate and the fruit. And it was just beautiful. It was like he was like a child again, and you just saw him as God sees him. And it was a beautiful moment. It was great. I loved it.
You probably got that sense just from listening to him that he's a guy who can, and you get this in his writing as well, that he is super academic, and he'll drop things that it's just like, Johannine and the non-commodity library. But then in the midst of that, he's just talking like a normal bloke, that you're just like hanging out with,
I kind of see him as he's doing his scholarship almost as a kid with his Legos. Like he's just having fun. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The most fun that he had in that entire interview was, you could see the way he was like gay magician.
He was just so happy that he got to say, "Is Jesus a gay magician?" Like he was just so happy he got to say that phrase.
This is the second time we've discussed it. Remember, we talked about this with Austin Stevenson. He brought up the gay magician idea. This is what our podcast can be known for.
The gay magician guys. That's it.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, that was a really interesting talk. He brought up it was interesting with the secret Gospel of Mark stuff, how everyone's so quick to be like, oh, you're on one side or the other, but he was just taking this nuanced position, like it doesn't need to be a forgery. There's the guy can really have thought he found this while still being mistaken, because history is nuanced and complicated, and that's the problem with popular depictions and sensationalizing. We just
Not
give
even
the stuff.
mistaken. He just didn't really ever think it was truly an authentic letter from Clement.
Yeah, he didn't want to put too much on it. So he might get associated with it, and then he becomes synonymous with that document. But he wasn't totally sold on it, which shows a little that hesitancy is like, well, maybe he didn't forge it. Maybe he too wasn't sure. It's really interesting, and
Yeah.
yeah,
I highly recommend his book, Fabricating Jesus. It's 20 years old now, but I still think that if I were to rank, you stole my book, and
I'm sitting
you
here.
had to let the author know.
If you're listening to this on Spotify with just the audio, not the video, I'm literally holding up a physical copy of Seth's version of Fabricating Jesus, which I borrowed from him like 15 years ago. And about once a year, he calls me up ranting about how he wants his copy of it back because he needed to
Still
consult
do.
it for some chapter or footnote or something.
All that to say, it's a well-written book. If freshman Seth can get through it, and freshman Seth, if you knew him, he doesn't get through books, then you should you will enjoy that book
Yeah.
a lot. I just remember, like, in high school, this was the Da Vinci Code. We wanted to talk about it with him, but we ran out of time. The Da Vinci Code era, John. Do you remember that?
Yeah, like Jesus was married, he had a child, she's still
The
alive,
holy
she's
bloodline.
globetrotting with Tom Hanks. Like, yeah,
Yes, exactly.
yeah.
And I just remember how disturbed I felt as a high schooler. I was like, oh gosh, is this going to completely rewrite? It feels so naive to talk about that now, but at the time you didn't know. You're a high schooler. And then reading that book was like such a breath of fresh air. It's like, oh, thank
Yeah.
goodness. Dan Brown is borderline illiterate. Oh.
It is interesting what is the doubt for each age and how the next age looks back at it. Because you're right. Like, to think today that the Da Vinci Code is a genuine challenge to faith is hilarious. But at the time, I remember talking to a non-Christian, and they literally brought up the Da Vinci Code. Like, you can't trust any of this stuff. I just watched the Da Vinci Code. Like, Jesus in the God, and for that time period, those were the real challenges, and it was refreshing to have an actual scholar at the top of their field come along and be like, guys, slow your roll. This stuff is not good scholarship. And over again, we're going to maybe not naively come back to the four gospels, but like there's a reason the church went with these. And like these were the earliest ones. Like, stop pretending Thomas or these other ones get you quite as close. They don't.
And it's funny too, because it's like every generation, it feels like what you're talking about. We had the Da Vinci Code, and then we also had the New Atheist. Do you remember them?
The new atheist, like Dawkins is gonna
Richard
rip
Dawkins.
Religion, yeah.
The God Delusion, a New York Times bestseller for something like 50 some weeks or something in a row. And I at the time, it was like a big deal. He was on CNN, like all these major news networks. And then, just over the past couple years, we're living 20 years on from the publication of that book. And I have taken a straw poll of college students over the past couple years, over 200 at this point. Oh, well over 200. I've asked them, has anyone here heard of Richard Dawkins? Do you know how many have raised their hands and have heard of him?
2?
1.
Just one. Wait, and these are Christian college students, right?
These are Christian college. Yeah, these were either at a church or at a college, a Christian college.
Because if you'd asked that question at Ozark Christian College when we were undergrads, everyone would have said yes, even if they hadn't read The God Delusion. Because we thought, oh, this is the big challenge to the church in our age, and now it's kind of just gone. It died.
And same with, like, I mean, you'll still get things about the Gnostic Gospels. They'll always have a life, but I think that existential threat for something like that it doesn't feel as real anymore, especially when you have people like Craig Evans who are out there who are actually publishing books. It's like, yeah, this is the real scholarly consensus. You got some people arguing some really weird things over there, but that's just scholarship. You always got weirdos. I
Yeah,
mean, just look at
there's
us.
outliers for everything. Yeah, it's humbling. It's humbling because we take ourselves and our moment and our time and culture and our doubts and our assurances, we take those things so seriously. And 15 years from now, will anyone even know what you're talking about? Will anyone care anymore?
Ooh, this got
Maybe.
deep.
Yeah. It's humbling. It's very humbling.
You,
When you said nobody knows who Dawkins is, I mean, I knew Dawkins was on the way out, but not only 1 out of 200 college students at a Bible college like out. I thought it was slower than that. And no, we're getting old, Seth. We're becoming irrelevant very quickly, but we're still young enough to find new ways to be relevant. But
well,
it is weird.
He had a book launch when I was at Oxford, and it was like him trying to revive. It was another. I don't even remember the title of it, but it was
The
basically a
newer
sequel to
atheists.
the new atheists.
The
It
God
was
delusion, plural.
the God delusions. It was it was a sequel essentially to the God delusion, and they basically didn't have anyone show up to the book launch at Blackwell, which is one of the biggest publishers in the world. Basically, no one showed up, and it's just, like it's just dead. I know college students now when I talk about the Da Vinci Code, and for them it's a movie that their parents watched.
Yeah.
You know,
It's not an existential threat
it's
to,
yeah, they don't even know what about
God.
it. No, it's a fiction movie with Tom Hanks. And I don't know. All that to say is you probably all came here to learn more about the Gnostic Gospels, and now John is challenging you with existential questions deeply about the meaning of life.
Well, but I mean, it is a historical point. People today and 10 years from now might not appreciate what the Gnostic Gospels did for faith and doubt in the early 2000s, early 2010s. Like, those were very hard questions. And
Yeah.
our whole training as philosophy religion guys was in that context. And now it's just, yeah, I don't know.
You should do, John?
What?
Forge a new Gnostic Gospel.
Oh my gosh.
Where Jesus reads the journey of God.
And he unveils to me the secret gospel of Jonathan, and teaches me the mystery. The mystery.
You're still